It's a really hard one.
There's not exactly like a clear answer when it comes to consent. It's not just black and white.
Condensing these things down and these whole motions into single words is kind of at the kernel of consent. When consent is broken, it breaks in a way which is equally as condensed and as significant as just the motion of trying to condense all that into one single statement in the first place.
I think defining consent is really interesting because first we must remember that consent isn't primarily about sex. It's about us withholding our own freedom. It's about us having determination of what we do with our body. Consent isn't simply just about sex, but it's very important when it's about sex.
I'd define consent as the cornerstone of any relationship.
Consent to me is agreeing wholeheartedly.
It's an agreement between people.
A clear and unambiguous agreement from somebody that they want to engage in intimate sexual activity with you.
There's an agreement, something around agreeing to something and knowing what it is you're agreeing to. Being able to withdraw that agreement at any time is also a big part of consent.
Consent is also fluid, and anyone has the right to withdraw consent at any time.
And also that consent to me is something you can withdraw should you wish to. 10 seconds in, 1 minute in, 10 minutes in, 1 hour in, 2 hours in. You can withdraw consent at any time.
Consent's not a red light, green light situation. It feels like there's a kind of a degree, there's areas of comfort.
For me, consent is a contract between two or potentially more people about what you will find acceptable, pleasurable even, and kind of just having an open and honest conversation. It's not just about what you don't want to do, it's very much about what you would enjoy and what you do want to do.
The lack of it is dangerous, and the more of it we have, the safer, better and more enjoyable life, sex and love are.
When I'm creating an idea of what consent is for me, I work in images and visuals, so consent for me is a frame. It's something that we create around ourselves. That frame is a containing device which keeps us safe, and sometimes consent can be taken away from us and we no longer feel safe. Consent is really integral to who we are as people. It's the foundation and it's the frame that we build around ourselves.
Consent is an ongoing understanding and relationship of trust. So it's two hands holding each other. And those hands can get tighter, they can get looser. It's only when those hands pull apart that consent has been lost. And who's involved? How do you know them? You know, you wouldn't shake a stranger's hand in the same way as you'd shake that of a friend.
The definition of consent is having the freedom and the capacity to make an informed choice.
The ability to be in control.
You know, it's a conversation. You know, it might be verbal, it might be through body language, but it's a conversation that, you know, people need to have.
Whether you have someone has a capacity to agree in the first place is also really important.
In fact, it's always a good idea to probably assume no consent and go from that point.
Is that person in compos mentis? Are they, are they inebriated or under the influence of drugs or something like that, such that they don't really have the responsibility to provide that consent? So there's something I think which is really important about sort of active consent and implicit consent. And the responsibility for that, lies not just with the person who provides that consent, but it should also lie with the person who that person is with.
It also applies to all types of sexual situations. So that includes things like BDSM or group sex or sex with sex workers. And in some situations, consent can't be given, such as if someone is highly intoxicated, for example, or underage or unconscious.
So consent is right there at the point where language and meaning expression meets the body.
I have loads of answers to this, so it's knowing where to begin.
To me, consent is the bedrock of trust. Trust to me is the sexiest thing there is really when you are engaging intimately with somebody, so consent is sexy.
For me personally, I take for granted a lot of how much, people give me that room
to give my consent. I feel very privileged to have that consent, or be able to give my consent without feeling forced or coerced.
What consent means to me is that my choice is respected and valued and taken for what it is.
It gives me an empowerment to feel safe, to know that I have a voice, to know that I can speak for myself. And as a therapist, I think that's really important, to be able to endow people with that power as well, to give them the ability to know how to sustain their boundaries and to be able to advocate for themselves.
Knowing it's something I really want to do, being comfortable, not just with myself, but with the other person I'm with. Enjoying the experience from start to finish, not feeling at any point within that experience that I want the experience to end. And if I did want it to end, then I would say I'm withdrawing my consent from here.
It's about making sure that I get the most out of an experience, the most enjoyment, the most pleasurable time that I can have with a partner or a range of partners, and just being really open and honest without making it a difficult, clinical and tricky conversations.
Consent means a lot to me. If you're someone who's lost your right to consent, had it voided by someone else, then it's really precious to be able to give consent to someone else. And it's precious to be able to hear the consent of another person as well. It's that moment of trust that can stretch onwards.
I don't think consent always needs to be verbal or explicit, but it needs to be understood between the two or more people that are engaging in whatever activity that is.
The first thing that comes up is the ability to choose.
I have the choice in what I participate in, what I do, what I own. No one has ownership on me.
The conversation around consent is it means something to me around ethics as well. If a relationship is ethical, is there a space for consent to be talked about, for example?
I think that consent is something that should always be talked about, and I think consent is something we should learn before we do something and not learn as an after effect of something. I never think we should learn about consent as a result of something.
So consent to me is something that I don't think is really addressed enough in our education system, which I find very scary. I feel like if consent is addressed at an earlier age and spoke about as something that's not taboo, maybe sexual harms, they might decrease potentially. I think our education system really needs to do something to address the lack of talk about consent.
I think when you hear the word consent, your mind jumps to the statutory minimum age of consent being 16, which is a number, a really good number. But it isn't the beginning and end of what consent is to me. I was a child when I experienced sexual abuse, and the perpetrator of that sexual abuse was not yet 16. He hadn't met the statutory minimum age of consent himself, yet that was still abuse. The reason it's so important is a child can't comprehend the consequences that comes from sex. They can't consent because they don't know what they're consenting to. They don't know what the end outcome will be. They don't understand the pain, the consequences for that action. The same with why we won't let a child undertake a loan or sign a legal agreement or a contract, because they can't consent to that. That's why that age of 16 is so important, because without it, we don't have a line to say you can't. And I'm not saying that line is perfect, but we've drawn one and it's a start. But it's only the start of the conversation, because consent is so much bigger than that. It's knowing all the pieces, it's knowing the possible harms, it's risk assessing, being able to give that person the freedom of self-determine with full knowledge and being able to self-risk assess if they want to undertake that operation. But it's also when you remove that, when that's removed from you, you also can't make that decision. If we don't look at the consequences together, if we don't look at what a lack of consent means, then we don't understand why consent is important and what consent is. It might be a hot topic to talk about, but if we don't talk about it, then we're going to have more people in the situation that I'm in and that a lot of the people that are talking are in.
It always must touch again on that reel of that breakage of language and of the body. And it's important that we do so, because that means that people are ready to share their story, share their narrative, share the history of their trauma. There's a lot of people who come into our service who are not at the point really to at all take it out of their own bodies and out of their own words. It's still something they're very much working with. And the first port of call for us is always to work with those people to get to that point where we can even begin to make the unspeakable spoken.
I think that's why it's really important why We Are Survivors are addressing consent in our 16th year.